Ah, Venice, the city that looks like Patrick's star. When people imagine Venice, they picture gondolas slipping through narrow canals, Renaissance palaces rising out of the water, and millions of tourists wandering across the Rialto Bridge every year. And that Venice is real. But it's only a tiny part of the story, because just a few kilometers away, across a straight, perfectly engineered causeway, there's another Venice. A Venice that isn't about gondolas or cruise ships full of tourists. It's a Venice of apartment blocks, highways, chemical plants, container terminals, and massive industrial basins carved directly into the lagoon. A Venice most tourists never see, and many don't even know exists. This is Mestre in Porto Marghera, the mainland city where most Venetians actually live, and where some of Italy's most important industries once stood. It's a landscape shaped by jobs, pollution, decline, and attempts at redevelopment, all while the entire region faces an ongoing fight against rising sea levels. So in this video we're going to explore the parts of the seemingly beautiful city that you never see. Of course, tourism plays the biggest role in the metro area, so we'll start with the postcard Venice sitting inside the lagoon first. But then we'll dig into the interesting part, the industrial side almost nobody talks about, and the uncertain future of a lagoon metropolis that is literally sinking while the sea keeps rising. Let's explore Venice, both the beautiful one and the ugly one. Let's start with the Venice everyone knows. The historic island city that attracts millions of tourists every year. This is the core and old town of the city, a compact group of small islands connected by canals and bridges, where most streets are waterways and where nearly every building is centuries old. It's a part of the city visitors see first, and often the only part they ever explore. The origins of Venice date back to the early Middle Ages, when people from the mainland settled in the lagoon during periods of conflict. These scattered communities eventually merged, and by around the 11th century, Venice had developed into the center of the Republic of Venice, a major maritime power. Its strategic location between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean turned the city into a hub for trade, shipbuilding, and diplomacy. Many of its most recognizable sites reflect this period of influence. St. Mark's Basilica, the Doge's Palace, Rialto Bridge, and the historic palaces lining the Grand Canal, to name a few. These are the areas that appear in travel brochures and social media pictures. The postcard Venice you know, we all know. For decades, tourism in Venice wasn't just about visitors arriving by train or plane. It was also about cruise ships. Large vessels would enter the lagoon and pass directly in front of St. Mark's Square to dock at the cruise terminal. The site became famous, but also controversial. Concerns about erosion, waves, air pollution, and the visual impact of huge ships next to historic buildings led Italy to restrict large cruise vessels from entering the San Marco Basin in 2021. Today, most large cruise ships are diverted to terminals outside of the historic city center, with Porto Marghera being one of the major alternatives. More on that later. In fact, for centuries the only way to reach Venice was by boat though. That changed in 1846 when the first railway bridge connected the islands to the mainland. A road causeway followed in the 1930s, creating today's Ponte della Libertà, the nearly 4-kilometer link used by all car, bus and train traffic entering the city. Despite this connection, the historic center remains relatively small in population. Only around 50,000 people still live on the main islands, and the number is steadily decreasing. Most residents of the municipality of Venice now live on the mainland, not within the famous canal network. And to understand modern Venice, the Venice where the majority of locals actually live, we have to leave the postcard behind and cross the causeway to Mestre and Porto Marghera. Once you cross the Ponte della Libertà, Venice immediately changes character. The canals and narrow alleys end, and you arrive in Mestre, the mainland city where most Venetians actually live. It looks and functions like a typical modern Italian town. Wider streets, apartment blocks, shops, schools, offices, and a transport network built around buses, trains, and a very weird tram. Mestre grew rapidly in the 20th century, especially as nearby Porto Marghera developed into a major industrial zone. Workers needed housing and services that simply couldn't fit into the historic islands, so the mainland became the logical place to expand. Over time, Mestre turned into the main residential and commercial center of the municipality. Today, while around 50,000 people live in the historic center, roughly 3 times as many live on the mainland in Mestre and the surrounding districts. This is where you find most of the everyday infrastructure: hospitals, supermarkets, sport facilities, and everything that requires space that the Lagoon city simply doesn't have. For many visitors, Mestre also serves as an affordable base for exploring the old town. Hotels are cheaper here, parking is easier, and trains and buses reach Venice historic center in just a few minutes. Even though it rarely appears in tourist photos, Mestre is essential for understanding modern Venice. It's a practical side of the city, the part that keeps the historic islands even functioning in modern times. And from here, the landscape shifts again as you move toward the industrial waterfront of Porto Marghera, which shaped much of Venice's modern history. A short distance southwest of Mestre, the landscape changes again. The residential streets end and you enter Porto Marghera, the industrial zone that has defined much of Venice's modern economy. It was created in the early 20th century as a planned industrial port, built on reclaimed land along the edge of the lagoon. Instead of canals and historic buildings, you see shipping basins, warehouses, rail yards, oil tanks, and chemical plants. For decades, Porto Marghera was one of Italy's major industrial hubs. It was designed to connect directly to national rail lines and to deep water channels that allowed large cargo ships to reach the terminals. Even today, it remains the core of the Port of Venice, handling millions of tons of goods every year. But the area also carries a difficult legacy. Industrial activity left behind significant pollution, and several sites in Porto Marghera are officially classified as contaminated and in need of remediation. Over time, many factories downsized or closed, leaving behind empty lots, abandoned buildings, and environmental challenges that are still being addressed. At the same time, parts of Porto Marghera remain active. Container terminals, logistics facilities, and energy-related industries continue to operate, and some redevelopment projects are underway to clean up former industrial areas and give them new uses. The port has also taken on a larger role in handling cruise and ferry traffic after the restrictions were placed on large ships entering the historic center. Porto Marghera is a side of Venice that surprises most people. A highly industrial landscape located just across the water from a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's a crucial piece of understanding how Venice functions today and how it might adapt in the future. The challenges facing Venice today are very different from the ones that shaped it in the past. The city is dealing with a combination of environmental pressure, demographic decline, and economic dependence on a single sector that both sustains and strains it: tourism. One of the biggest physical threats is water. Venice has always experienced high tides, but rising sea levels and gradual subsidence have made flooding more frequent and more severe. Events like the 2019 Acqua Alta, which flooded over 80% of the historic center, highlighted how vulnerable the city is. To counter this, Italy built a MOST barrier system, a set of mobile gates at the lagoon's inlets that can temporarily separate the lagoon from the Adriatic during extreme tides. The system has already prevented several major floods, but its long-term effectiveness will depend on how quickly sea levels continue to rise and how often the gates need to be raised. Another major issue issue is the population decline. The historic center keeps losing residents due to high living costs, limited space, and the difficulty of maintaining everyday life on the islands. With only around 50,000 people left in the old town, essential services are gradually shifting to the mainland. The result is a slow transformation of Venice from a living city into something closer to an open-air museum. On the mainland, Mestre and Porto Marghera face their own challenges. Mestre must absorb the population and services that move out of the lagoon, while Marghera continues working through decades of industrial pollution and the need to redevelop abandoned sites. These areas will play a major role in shaping what the Greater Venice becomes over the next decades. And then there's tourism, the one factor that connects all parts of the city. Venice needs tourism to survive economically. Hotels, restaurants, transport, cultural institutions, and even many residents depend on visitor spending. At the same time, the sheer amount of tourism puts pressure on the city's fragile infrastructure, drives up housing costs, and spreads the perception that Venice is becoming a place designed primarily for visitors, not for locals. Recent measures, such as redirecting large cruise ships away from the historic center, introducing crowd management tools, and experimenting with day visitor fees, show how the city is trying to balance economic needs with preservation. But the challenge remains: how to continue welcoming millions of visitors while still supporting the communities who still live here and keep the lagoon environment stable. The future of Venice will depend on this balance. A city protected from rising water, supported by its mainland districts and still able to function as more than a backdrop for tourism. Whether that balance succeeds will decide what Venice looks like in the next century, and whether it remains not just a symbol of the past, but a place that can still sustain real life. That was Venice behind the scenes. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel further, you could join my Patreon. It really helps me making more videos about fascinating cities all around the world. To all of you who already decided to support me over there, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.